Senate Energy and Utilities Committee, Finance and Policy. Today's date is January 31st, 2017. We are meeting first in joint session with our friends from the House. Welcome, Chair Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having us here today.
Appreciate you being here. And yes, members that are not members of the Senate, you'll see little red switches in front of you. You do need to turn those on to speak so that we can get that on the recording, as well as amplify for the folks in the back of the room. So with that, we will begin the joint meeting on affordability of new coal technology, the Lignite Energy Council, Great River Energy, and Great Plains Institute. Would those folks come to the podium, please? Thank you. Welcome to the committee, and please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
To the chairman and members of the committee, my name is Mike Holmes, and I'm the Vice President for Research and Development with the Lignite Energy Council.
Mr. Chairman, fellow committee members, my name is Nathan Domyahn. I'm a director of our Generation Engineering program with Great River Energy.
Chairs, members, my name is Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute.
Thank you. Please begin your testimony.
Again, my name is Mike Holmes, and I'm presenting first, and I'm going to focus on the research and development side of energy. And I'm the Vice President of Research and Development for the Lignite Energy Council. Before that, I've spent 30 years doing research and development on different energy type topics. The Lignite Energy Council is a trade organization of over 250 members related to advancing technology and keeping the existing facilities running for the lignite-fired power production. We work in collaboration. We're part of 3 different research divisions of the North Dakota Industrial Commission, including the renewable energy, the oil and gas research, and the lignite research. And as part of the effort, we believe in an all of the above strategy. In order to be able, we use that to be able to optimize the regional resources to get low cost, clean, that affordable power that we all rely on. And with that, we can then base load the intermittent sources of renewable energy like wind and solar and others. And then we can also supply that affordable energy to residents as well as the regional industry. And through that, we then can create jobs and affordable electricity to the residents of our region. So as part of that, to make that a continued reality, we can look at the years of research and development that have gone into technology. Investment in technology has been a very good success for a long time. So what this graph shows, and I won't go into all the detail, but it shows since 1970 what the trends are. So this is data from the EPA and the EIA, which is the Energy Information Associate from the U.S. government. And basically some of the key points on the graph are that since 1970 through the data goes through 2014, the gross domestic product has gone up by a factor of 3.4, so 240% increase in GDP, with the electricity going up by a factor of around 2.5. And during that time, because of technology improvements, investments, the emissions for all energy sectors, transportation, electricity, all have gone down around the order of 70% plus. And that's because we've tackled with technology things like particulate, sulfur, NOx, trace elements, and now we're working on a lot of the projects I'll show you quickly are focused on CO2. So we continue to make investments in technologies that can continue to bring low-cost power to drive the economy and do it with a lower and lower carbon footprint, and do it while enabling renewable energy to also thrive. So I'm going to skip over these and get to some of the current R&D projects that are currently being invested in and look at the new technologies that can continue that trend that we've seen. Some of the categories, and one of them I'll talk about, is a transformational technology. If you were to build a new power plant, what would the technology be that can minimize any CO2 footprint as well as keep that low-cost power? And the one we're going to present on and talk about today is there's a large investment with the industry partners and the state of North Dakota on a technology called the alum cycle. So I'll present on that, as well as technologies for enhancing the existing power production assets and the carbon capture utilization and storage I'll hit briefly, and then just briefly talk about the diversity of the research. It includes things like evaluating extraction of rare earth elements from feedstocks from coal-related operations, as well as advanced reclamation, so that you're returning the land to as good or better than it was before you started mining coal or doing anything else. So with that, I'm going to go into the transformational technology, and again, this one's called the alum cycle, and without getting into the details, instead of driving the power production with steam, you create and use a high-pressure CO2 to make the power production. And then on the back end, you get a storage-ready or a sequestration-ready stream of CO2 at pressure. So what they're doing now is they're developing this technology. There's a demonstration scheduled to be started up in just outside of Houston, Texas, in this summer, July of 2017. And it's a 25 megawatt electric demonstration. And we're looking at how you turn that into use of solid fuels. So instead of natural gas to fire and drive the system, we're looking at using solid fuels to create a synthesis gas and using that to drive the system. So it's just an alternate way to do it. The targets are to have near zero emissions of CO2. And in our region, we can use that CO2 to free up additional oil. And then also to get about 40% improvement in the efficiency of current systems. And then to target, as you see on the slide, on the order of 4 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. So targeting electricity rates similar to what we're used to, so that we can keep from losing industry by keeping those rates down. And so the focus is on first looking at any barriers to making that technology a reality. And so we're doing a current research and development project of about $10 million on that. In parallel, they have the demonstration down in LaPorte, Texas, just outside of Houston, on natural gas, and that's a $150 million investment. And then following that, we're going to take all the data and look at use engineering and models to figure out what it would take to do a 250 megawatt commercial scale first-of-a-kind demonstration. So that's the target for that one. And I've already mentioned that the solution is to get that near zero CO2 emissions and use the CO2 to produce additional oil. So it's a combined effort. And I just briefly want to put up one slide and talk about the geology in our region. So a lot of investment has gone on in this region for looking at how the geology is set up to store CO2 for long term, and the answer is the geology is really good. And not only that, the oil and gas opportunities are incredible. We have, for several decades, we have enough storage capacity in just the conventional oil wells if we were to use the CO2 for additional oil for transportation fuels. If you look at the tight oil, the Bakken it's called, the estimates are that we could use that opportunity for an additional 2 to 3 billion tons of CO2 storage, so way more than we would ever have CO2 available from power production. And then we can extend that opportunity for oil and gas up to a 5-generation type opportunity. So there's plenty of opportunity to help the economics of carbon capture and storage by using it initially for the oil opportunity. So the next one is something, and the Minnesota utilities have been key to all of these types of projects that have gone on throughout the Lignite Energy Council's R&D program. This one happens to be called Project Tundra, and it's a way of looking at capturing CO2 from an existing facility and then storing that CO2. So it's a bolt-on capture facility to an existing facility. So it's called Project Tundra, and it's being driven by Minn Kota Power and Elite Clean Energy are two of the main people, as well as BNI, Clean Coal, North American Coal, and others. And so if you look at this and the path forward, they already have one, just went into operation in January commercially down in Texas. This is looking at taking the capture technology to our region and moving it that next step so that you can further reduce the cost of the first of a kind being demonstrated down at Texas. And you can look at some of the unique properties of our coal and our opportunity for utilization of the CO2. And the goal is to get this driven by the economics of the value of the CO2, and then while you're producing that oil, you are storing that CO2. So this is just a little visual of how it works. You bolt on the capture plant to the back end, capture the CO2, clean it up, and then you store it in the geology and produce additional oil. And this, similar to the other one, we have the roadmap, the timetable, and the next step is to go through those engineering studies and models to fully understand the economics, reduce the risk, and get ready for a large-scale application. So those are pretty much the two I wanted to focus on. The last slide here just shows some of the diversity. We have a whole suite of other different projects that range from everything to returning the land to better productivity than before the mining occurs. And you're going to hear next about one that Great River Energy does that looks at improving the fuel before you utilize it. So with that, if there are any questions, Chairman or members of the committee, I'd be happy, or I can turn it over and wait till the end.
Thank you. Are there, I think it's best for us to try and take questions as we go through each testifier. Are there any questions for this testifier? Representative Garofalo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the testifiers. Two questions. So number one, you mentioned in your presentation regarding the alum cycle on CO2, but what about the other emissions, NOx, SOx, mercury? What's the expected emissions profile of those items?
So as with the current fleet, we have the regulation requirements for these emissions, and we would go beyond. The SOx and NOx are easily taken care of in the technology once it's proven commercial. The high pressure nature of the system makes them want to come out into and be absorbed into a scrubber, similar to what Coal Creek does for Great River Energy, only the high pressure makes it even easier.
Representative Garofalo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the testifier, so right now we basically have two different options for no carbon or low carbon energy sources. Nuclear, which has the problem of spent nuclear fuel, wind and solar, which have problems with intermittency. So if you're able to produce this energy with no carbon footprint and you're able to do it at a low price, I mean, why would we not do this?
Sir.
Chairman, members of the committee, that's a very excellent question, and as well, the answer is the only thing stopping us is the investment into the technology development to get it to that point where you reduce the risk because of the large investment in a commercial application. And you've nailed the intermittency challenges, and some of these types of units are critical to being able to base load the wind and solar so that we can keep growing those portfolios. We need the base load technologies like the plants with carbon capture that can cycle as we have intermittency.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for these nice seats. Nice over here in the Senate. The question that I have for you is, as we have seen in Germany, they've had some very unique struggles with their renewables and also with trying to phase or to move away from nuclear power. In response to that, as you probably know, the German government, they're building 10 new lignite power plants. And this is also, it seems to be the pattern now after Fukushima in Japan. We've also seen this in South Korea and Australia and Poland as well. My question to you is, are any of these advanced technology nations, is anyone else doing this anywhere else in the world?
Chairman and members of the committee, very excellent points and questions. The rest of the world is, especially if you look at China, India, and some of the other regions that are developing, are putting in new power plants faster than we can imagine. And so the investment is needed for places like Germany that are seeing that challenge and pushing the renewable portfolio to the point that they have the brownouts and the challenges, so they lose the reliability. So a lot of the other places in the world are starting to look at these types of technologies, some, but they are putting in power plants way faster than looking at the technology. But your statements very much emphasize the need for technology investments, because the CO2 footprint we have in a single power plant is nothing compared to the amounts that you would see in China and India with the rapid growth in their economy. The other thing I think you've pointed out and is very important is we need to keep looking at some of these examples like Germany and learn from what they've done. And the National Coal Council had a presentation on that and a study, so if anyone would like to follow up with me, I can get my hands on that and share that. But it looks at the problem of storage once you get to a certain level of renewables.
Representative Newberger. Oh, and in answer, Mr. Representative Newberger, for $90 million, the chairs better be comfortable. So, any further questions for this testifier? And we will move on to the next. State your name for the record, and please proceed with your testimony.
Mr. Chair, fellow committee members, thank you. My name is Nathan Domyahn. I'm director of our Generation Engineering Group in Maple Grove, Minnesota for Great River Energy. Great River Energy is a generation and transmission company that is owned by 28 member cooperatives that are in Minnesota and northwest Wisconsin. We are tasked with providing them with the generation plants and the high voltage transmission systems up to their distribution substations, and they take it from there to their members. For the next, well, here, I better pull up the presentation first. There we go. What I'm going to do here, this is a picture of Coal Creek Station. This is our largest coal-fired plant, located about an hour north of Bismarck, North Dakota. It's a 2-unit, 1,200-megawatt lignite-fired plant. I'm going to talk about a technology called dry finding. This is a technology that some innovative and intelligent people with my company have patented, and it's today a commercially available technology that's working at this plant that is improving coal before it's burned at 2 of our plants, this plant and Spiritwood Station, which is located near Jamestown, North Dakota. So again, this is a technology that involves the innovative use of waste heat that's otherwise exhausted to the atmosphere. that is not of sufficient quality or energy to be transformed into electricity from traditional power plant technologies, but it is good enough to heat air in this, to heat up air that is used to segregate and dry the coal at this plant is lignite. So through these two improvements, through segregation and drying, we're able to reduce air emissions, coupled with lowering O&M costs and increasing the efficiency of the plant. So I'm going to briefly touch on what that is in the next few slides. So if you go to slide number 2, this is a visual of a traditional coal plant and is representative of Coal Creek Station. So if you look on the left side of the graph, you can see what the primary things that dry finding is doing. It's lowering the moisture in the fuel, so we have to burn less coal to get the same amount of electricity out. It is also a contaminant removal device, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, but it basically is a density segregation device that takes pyrites, clays, dirt, rock out of the coal before it's ever burned and turned into ash. These pyrites also have much higher levels of sulfur and mercury in them, and before they're ever consumed, they are taken out and put back in the ground where we found them. And so this is unique in that you don't see a lot of technologies that are, one, commercially available, and two, reduce emissions and increase efficiencies and reduce O&M costs. So it's kind of a win-win-win for existing and new coal plants. The waste heat that's used to heat up the air, that's used to dry the coal, is basically heat exchangers that are put in the ductwork that you see here. That is lower grade. That is, to heat up air to about 280 degrees, and that 280 degree air, 270 degree air, is pushed across the coal to dry it. This energy, like I said, would otherwise be wasted. How it works. This is kind of a mass balance and talks about the two major components of the coal drying. There's the actual coal dryer and the air jig. If you look on the top left-hand corner, you'll see 100, this is a diagram showing 100 tons of coal right out of the coal mine. And this is a mine mouth coal plant. So the mine is right adjacent to the coal plant. That's why the coal plant's there. If you look at the red dots and the black dots represent the coal. That's the stuff we want to burn. Compared to the red dots there represent the contaminants, the pyrites, the clays, the dirts, the rocks that we want to get out of there. The fluidizing hot air that's taken from waste heat comes up through the bottom, and you can kind of think of it as an air hockey game. That fluidizes the coal and will lift it up over a weir that's taken out as the dry finding product. That hot air is also taking 9-10 tons of moisture right up a stack and never sees the boiler. That segregated coal, and you can kind of see as it goes into the air jig, there's still a little coal in there as well as a number of contaminants. That goes to an air jig where another segregation process takes place, again using density separation where air is brought in underneath and further refines that coal so the contaminants get taken out and the coal is reprocessed and brought to the boilers. That's the technology that we have patented and that we are marketing across the world. 2/3 of this world is living in Southeast Asia and China and is primarily building new and counting on low-grade coals to electrify their countries. And we are marketing this technology. If you look at the bottom right, that's an actual picture of one of the dryers at Coal Creek Station. So in terms of its impact, emissions impact, we're taking out 10% of the moisture, we're burning 10% less coal. We're taking, lignite is typically about 40% moisture. We're reducing that to 28 to 30%. Through doing this, through taking out the pyrites, the segregation of those contaminants, plus improved collection efficiencies in the existing scrubber, because you are tasking them less, we are removing 54% less SO2 with this technology than before. Again, with mercury, the segregation of the ash minerals, those contaminants, plus improved collection efficiencies with the technologies we have there, we have seen a 40% reduction in mercury. By reducing the fuel, the volume of the gases, the air and fuel in the boiler itself, we're able to basically get better fuel-to-air ratios and reduce our NOx emissions by 32%. And with the 4% cycle improvement efficiency, we're reducing CO2 emissions by 4%. And this is coupled with a 20% plus $1 million in annual savings in operation and maintenance costs. And that's basically, you're overhauling your coal mills less. You've got less, all of this less, basically ash to get disposed of. There's just a lot of less wear and tear, a lot less parasitic loads on your fans and your mills. All of this is being done. So it's not just something that reduces emission, it also helps the economies of the scale and lower your cost of electricity from this facility. If you look at efficiency improvement, this is the source of this is an EPRI report, which stands for Electric Power Research Institute. It's a peer-reviewed kind of renowned energy R&D center, and this report shows the various technologies that you can use to just improve efficiency. This has nothing to do with emissions, but this is something just to get a better efficiency. And you can see the third one down there, the low T fuel drying, which is basically dry fining. Low temperature fuel drying is what that stands for. And most of the other technologies here, especially the higher efficiency ones, are basically, you're putting in a whole new boiler. A lot higher pressure, ultra, supercritical kinds of things. This is on Coal Creek is a subcritical plant, which is a lower pressure and temperature plant. And so a lot of those things are just at an existing plant, just are not feasible from an economic perspective. So, and this one is. This can be put on existing plants, this can be designed into new ones. So, and lastly, this is my last slide before any questions and any questions you may have. We are actively marketing this. We believe that this is a technology that can be used at existing plants in the U.S. and across the world. We have marketing agreements with Black & Veatch currently, which is a large engineering and architectural firm. And we're in discussion with other OEM manufacturers of energy production equipment to really show them the value of this technology so it can be used and recognized by others. We are going around to various conferences, journals, articles. We're going all around the world trying to market this stuff and show the advantages of dry fining. It did win, dry fining did win Project of the Year from Power Engineering back in 2010. So it's been recognized as, you know, an effective way at an existing power plant or a new power plant to reduce emissions and increase efficiencies. Thank you. I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Domyahn. Domyahn. Questions from the panel? Seeing none, we will continue to the next testifier. Please step up, state your name for the record, and begin your testimony.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, my name is Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute. And just give me 1 second to get my slides up. Oh. Well, it's not advancing. It's not advancing on the screen. What am I doing wrong?
Give it a moment. It's thinking.
While we're, apologies for that, I'll just go ahead and get started here. I'm with an organization called the Great Plains Institute. We are a mission-driven organization. Our mission is to transform the way we produce, distribute, and consume energy to be both economically and environmentally sustainable. There we go. We work in several ways. We try to develop better energy policy through consensus, through working with all the stakeholders and finding common ground. We support adoption and development of new energy technologies. and we try to provide reliable analysis information and reports. Throughout our work, we work on a lot of strategies to increase the use of renewables and energy efficiency, but we do support a portfolio approach to our energy system, and we do unambiguously see a need for carbon capture technology as part of a portfolio of energy technologies. So we do work nationally with stakeholder groups on policy to advance carbon capture from power sector and industrial sources. So why do we see this as so important? Well, there's a few reasons. There's a few challenges that suggest a role for carbon management in our energy system. One of them is the difficulty of reducing emissions from certain sectors, for example, certain industrial emissions. Airlines, for example, would be another source. We would predict that there's going to continue to be a role for fossil fuels and a need to manage the carbon from those sources over time. And a lot of analysis suggests, although that we could deploy a lot more renewables, there will be challenges at very high levels of renewables. It's unclear exactly what that threshold is. People talk about 80%, but it could be, we can debate the number, but there will be at some point at which you still do need a role for base load or any intermediate load generation, and that a lack of carbon management can make it more expensive to sort of manage some of the changes that are happening in our energy system. Sort of looking out into the future, we also anticipate a need for technology that actively removes carbon from the atmosphere. And there's a lot of strategies here, a lot of ways we could do that through using plants, soils, but carbon capture fits in with many of those strategies. And so the question becomes sort of those are out there in the future, what can we do today? And I think we look at carbon capture look at it the same way we look at a lot of things like watching the evolution of wind or solar over the last 40 years. You see this every time you double manufacturing capacity, the cost declines. And so that's why we've seen the cost of wind drop precipitously, the cost of solar, the cost of energy storage. And we're going to see that same kind of pattern with carbon capture technology. And to me, this should justify increased research or continued research and investment and deployment. The question comes about, what do we do now? And so we look at, with the economics we have today, what are some viable ways to move this technology forward? So utilization of carbon, finding, instead of thinking of carbon as a waste product, think of it as a raw material or as something that has value that people are willing to pay for. One of those things is enhanced oil recovery. So we have a long track record of this in the United States, not in Minnesota. We don't produce a lot of oil here. We do produce a lot of CO2. But we have over 40 years of experience with enhanced oil recovery. The process is you inject you inject CO2 into a mature oil well that's not producing. Most of the CO2 actually stays in the ground. You get more oil in the process. There's actually more CO2 being stored than that's being produced in the oil. And importantly, you're helping to build out a pipeline infrastructure for CO2 management that will be available for you in the future, whether or not you're doing EOR in the future. We have thousands of miles already of CO2 pipeline in the U.S. We've produced over 1 billion barrels of oil through this technique. It's about 4% of U.S. production. And one of the things, kind of looking out into the future, a lot of that pipeline infrastructure is in Texas and Wyoming. Some of this happens in Michigan. North Dakota's been a leader in this technique as well. We're partnering with Saskatchewan. But we have a lot of sources in the Midwest, and you could imagine a pipeline infrastructure that could extend nationally and draw Minnesota into the mix and help manage sources in our state. A lot of those green dots are ethanol plants, which happens to be you can pretty cheaply manage CO2 from ethanol plants, and that can become a new value stream. I just want to mention here, you know, it would be a whole separate presentation to talk about some of the federal policy in the carbon capture space, but we do work with a national coalition to promote some policy at the federal level. I just wanted to put this up to note that this is a very bipartisan issue. So we're working on a Senate bill in 2016 that included, you know, on one side of the aisle Mitch McConnell, on the other side of the aisle people like Senator Booker and former vice presidential candidate Senator Kaine. So again, strong support from both sides. I think recognition that this is an important strategy for our energy system. And I think one of the few issues at the federal level that has enjoyed bipartisan support. We do see ethanol as this is a really intriguing opportunity for ethanol. These oil companies will pay ethanol plants for their CO2. Archer Daniels Midland has a kind of a well-known carbon capture project in Illinois where they've captured and stored over 1 million metric tons in deep underground. There's several ethanol plants in Kansas that sell CO2 to oil producers for enhanced oil recovery. A lot of ethanol plants just sell CO2 for food and beverage, you know, carbonating drinks, that sort of thing. Another connection to Minnesota, I don't want this to all be about Texas. So, 3M actually, I asked them if they would mind. I'm not an expert on this, but I got a tour at their pilot plant, and this is a pretty interesting project. They are figuring out how to make energy and materials out of CO2, and it could be CO2 that they capture from the atmosphere. It could be CO2 from an ethanol plant. It could be CO2 from a power plant. But they have technology for taking CO2, combining it with renewable electricity, and basically making synthetic hydrocarbons, so making oil or gas or materials from CO2. So they look at this potential to make kind of everything we're making out of oil or natural gas now out of CO2. Another kind of interesting angle, and it just shows that this technology can develop in unpredictable ways and can provide benefit that we don't anticipate up front. One of the things 3M is looking at is, can we take CO2, produce liquids or gas, and basically use it as an energy storage strategy? So, you know, maybe if the wind's blowing at night and nobody's using power, you could make natural gas, put it into the natural gas grid, and then use that to, balance that variable renewable resource. I guess my closing comment would just be that, we do feel like a portfolio approach is important. We support increased deployment of renewables and energy efficiency, but we also support managing carbon from both renewable and fossil sources of energy as part of kind of a balanced energy system. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Are there questions from committee members? Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the other Mr. Chair. And I look at the other Mr. Chair and Senator Marty. You guys were part of that Lehigh Institute, and I believe the discussion on carbon capture was spent there. And I see you, Brandon. I've heard your Mr. Jordan this presentation many times, and I see Kenrick's in the audience too. The conversation surrounds around. I didn't see much about the Saskatchewan the project where the sulfuric dioxide that turns into sulfuric acid, which then some of the fly ash. And I guess, if there's any kind of return on investment that you see within this capturing moment that you had, I noticed you didn't have that, but if you could talk about that as well as, the topography in Minnesota. Is my understanding that we don't have the topography for carbon capture within Minnesota. So unlike Texas or, again, Saskatchewan, they did it because they just, they don't get sun and they get too much wind, but not enough sun. And so this is one way for them to look at lowering their carbon dioxide. So can you just kind of comment on that, if that's a fair question? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Senator Cohen. So what I'm most familiar with on the North Dakota and Saskatchewan side is the Weyburn project, which is a project, and I think my colleagues can probably talk more about that, but it's a a project where they capture CO2 from the Dakota Gasification Project. This really interesting 1970s era, Carter administration era gasification project, and they pipe CO2, I don't know, 100 miles or so up to Saskatchewan and do enhanced oil recovery in the Weyburn oil field. I'll address your second question, and maybe some of my colleagues here on the stand would have more to say about the Weyburn project. But it's true that Minnesota does not have, or that we're aware of, much geology that would be favorable for storage. However, we would have the ability to take CO2. We produce plenty of CO2, and if there are ways to turn it into liquid fuels or other things, we could do that here. And I think we also have the ability to, if we're going to build a national CO2 pipeline infrastructure, to make sure those pipelines serve Minnesota and that there's a opportunity for producers of CO2 in Minnesota to be part of that system and generate revenue if that is possible.
Senator Hoffman.
Thank you. As a follow-up, the proxemics to that and the infrastructure begs the next question. And I know, like in Texas, when they built their new coal plants, they had put the carbon dioxide capturing and was right there next door, and they were doing all their making of the ash from that side of it. So if you envision Minnesota doing that, how do you see us? I mean, there's got to be an issue with some infrastructure. There's going to be a cost associated with that. I just am trying to wrap my arms around, this isn't Texas, this isn't Saskatchewan, this is, a different set of guidelines here. So how do you envision seeing that?
Mr. Jordan?
Mr. Chair, Senator Cohen, there are some proposals floating for multi-state pipeline projects. I think it would just require excuse me, Senator Hoffman. I apologize.
No. I was
wondering
Mr.
why
Chair, this was actually pretty fun to be called Senator Cohen.
I do apologize for that, Senator. Try and recover here. That was a bad one. Oh boy.
That's okay. He forgives you.
Mr. Chair, Senator Hoffman. It would be a multi-state build-out, and there are some proposals for multi-state pipeline projects.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to make a comment today, how exciting this is to see this great new technology and the efficiencies that we can bring to talk about the real new future of clean coal. I'm very excited about that. I just wanted to make a comment to our colleagues here, and again, thank both chairs for bringing us all together today. This is how we should be doing this. I want to thank Senator Marty for helping me start to work on the SIP program that I think we need to update here in Minnesota. We've had the conversations that the SIP program, the Conservation Improvement Plan, that was started some 25 years ago, needs to be updated. So I just want to say that I really welcome these kind of conversations and looking at what we can do now today with today's technology to continue to work with this, because again, what you're doing here is exactly what we're talking about. So just want to say thank you for doing this.
Senator Goggin.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Jordan, I just have a question on how safe is it to manufacture and distribute these synthetic gas? And we've had a lot of issues in the news lately about pipelines, and I was just curious what your take is on that with this technology.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, members, I think it depends on what you're producing, of course, and I would imagine the goal would be to produce something that's chemically the same as sort of what we use now. So I would think that the same safety requirements that would be in place for natural gas or gasoline or diesel would apply to a synthetic version of the same product.
Representative Mullery. Or, I'm sorry, who's next? I think Mahoney. Sorry, Mullery Mahoney. Sorry, Representative Mahoney. I got the M right.
You know, as a senator, you start out at a certain level with me, and you didn't help.
That didn't help.
I have a number of questions, Mr. Chairman. What's been the total cost? Can anyone tell me on the clean coal research that we spent on? I know there's been fits and starts over the last 15 or 20 years. And the reason I ask the question is there's a comparison between when the research done on solar and the research done on wind energy, which is our two primary renewable energy sources. I'm just wondering what we've spent at this particular point on how to burn coal again. Who wants to take that one? You both, all of you look like you're going like, oh, I don't know.
Mr. Jordan or anybody who wants it.
This is Mike Holmes, Chairman, members of the committee. I can't give you a historical summary of how much. I can tell you current numbers over the last decade have been roughly, because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but roughly about 25% of the renewable research budget is how much goes into the fossil energy budget.
Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much CO2 is, we make a lot of it, How much of it is resaleable, and where would it be resold to? You've mentioned carbonated beverages, you've mentioned a couple others, but so how much do we make? How much of it is resaleable? Where do you sell it to now? And are you going to be able to sell it all in 10 years?
Mr. Holmes.
Yeah, Chairman and members of the committee, that's a very challenging question because it depends on where you're located. So we need technology investment to move things forward, but we also need those first-of-a-kind demonstrations. And in our region, we have the opportunity to, as was just stated, make the CO2 a commodity with value. And so in our region, we have enough oil and gas demand, especially as the Bakken gets developed, where we could utilize basically all the CO2 that we could produce for many generations. And then after that, again, the oil and gas activity is down about 2 miles in geology that's held natural gas for millions of years. So it's a very good, sound geology. So there's other geology down there, saline formations, where you could store order of magnitude plus additional CO2. But in the meantime, we have a commodity value that outsizes the actual supply of CO2 available in this region. Now that means that we would have to, again, for Minnesota plants, get the infrastructure in place, as was stated, so the pipelines could get it to those formations.
Representative Mahoney.
The nice thing about CO2 pipelines is that they should be less controversial because when they leak, you just get Pepsi.
Yep.
That's right.
Earlier, and I don't remember who it was that brought this up, but you were defining coal as coming back for a baseline energy source.
Yep.
And you threw out some numbers, and I wasn't quick enough to write them down. Could you expand on what you think, what role it would fill? I mean, are you looking at going back to the 1950s with baseline coal providing 90% of our energy, or are you going back to a couple years ago when it's down to 10, 20, 30, 50%?
Mr. Holmes. Or Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I do not have I can't put a number on it. There are a range of studies evaluating the sort of how much renewables we can put on the grid, and some of it just comes down to what are you willing to pay. But so I can't put a number on it. I think there's a lot of studies that suggest we can put quite a bit more renewables on the grid cost effectively. But at some point you do run up against some challenges. One of them is you don't just have variation during the day in something like wind or solar production, but you also have annual variation, which becomes much harder to manage and store. So again, what I guess I would suggest is it's probably not a, in your words, going backwards. I think it's defensible to say that there could be a lot more renewables on the grid than there are right now. But there might be an upper limit, and there might still be a role for, I believe there's still a role for base load, providing, as a portfolio, part of the portfolio.
Representative Mullery? Mahoney, I did it again. Sorry, I apologize. I know. I am not helping myself. Representative Mahoney.
You're just going to get me to vote for some bill so I can be on a conference committee with you and take it even.
Whatever it takes, Representative Mahoney.
And here's my problem with the technology, and I've been a technology guy since I got here, from the sciences to the biomedical and everything else. And, I've asked a series of questions here trying to get to some answers. And the problem is that when you have a technology like this, when you're doing research, you don't have a really solid answer. Because those are things, if you're looking for help from the state or to change someone's attitude, you really need stronger answers to them. Now, I haven't picked on the engineer at all, but I've been in a coal plant or two in my lifetime, and you deserve to be if you've ever designed one of those things. But my core question here is, when do we get a few more solid answers so that we can make more reasoned decisions here rather than just say nice things to each other? Do you have an idea as when that's coming?
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think there is more information regarding some of the questions you've asked. I know I'd be more than happy to come in and try and come armed with a few more specific facts and figures about some of your questions regarding, what's the amount of baseload that's needed in the system, what's been the level of investment, what do we expect in terms of cost reductions for carbon capture technology. I don't have all those things right at my fingertips right now, but I would be more than happy to discuss them offline.
We have time for two more questions. Senator Marty.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I wanted to comment on a couple of things here real quickly, one of which is that we talk about, I visited the GRE thing, and I think it's nice to see the 50% reduction in SO2 and 40% reduction in mercury. There's still problems. But it's good that we're doing that. It's good they're pushing the technology. That's very important. And carbon capture is important as well. And I think we ought to be exploring that every way we can. However, the Great Plains slide talks about how we're not going to be selling that much carbon dioxide for carbonated beverages. We wouldn't have a problem with greenhouse gases if we had enough carbonated beverages to use it. We're talking about the one example it's been used for is to store it underground and use it to produce it. And the Great Plains slide suggests instead of carbon capture by doing it, they say we're going to put out about as much CO2 in the oil as we are there. So in effect, we are not really capturing it there. We're capturing part of it and replacing it with putting more out. And when we have carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, 400 parts per million, when we do have, we may not want to admit it, but I don't remember 30, 40 years ago having a lot of rainy days in the wintertime in the Twin Cities. Things are changing, and they're changing very quickly, and we're going to have to address it. And these new technologies may be good for bits and pieces along the way, but if we're talking about a huge new carbon dioxide piping system around coal-fired plants, that's generations that's decades at least before that could come into a widespread thing that doesn't address the rest of the mercury problem, the SO2, the NOx, everything else. Very expensive, and we don't have that kind of time as we're continuing to put more CO2 in the atmosphere. And the only illustration I've heard that sounds like it's a reasonable market for CO2 now is the storage underground and using it to pump out more oil. And that's a carbon exchange in effect. So I just think we got to keep all that in perspective, because you're talking billions of dollars in investment over decades that don't solve the problem. And I think, Mr. Jordan, I'm sorry, I think the idea that we're going to have significant baseload power, fossil fuel power, 3 decades from now, I don't think it's going to be there. I think you're just wrong.
Senator Hoffman, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you, Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And now that Senator Marty brings up when I was 10 years old, I remember it was 110 below wind chill out in Hollywood Township, and the post-traumatic stress because of that. Now I'm going to have to go see my therapist, John. I'm sorry, I was trying to be funny, and that's not funny. But I forgot one question, Mr. Chair, because we're talking about the infrastructure, and if you're looking at some type of build-out, I guess the question to the panelists are there federal or state subsidies right now, for the clean coal? And if there are, can you, I guess I don't understand, can you tell me how much? I mean, is that a fair question? If there's federal, state subsidies, how much does that look like?
To any of the 3 testifiers? Mr. Holmes.
Yeah, Chairman, members of the committee, there are state R&D programs so that if you have a small-scale demonstration, you can get federal support for that to help leverage the funding that we have going towards research in the states as well as the industrial support. But then when you get to much larger demonstrations, like the Dakota gasification plant was mentioned, and they send about 2 million tons of CO2 up for permanent storage a year. And that, way back then, had a much larger federal support to make that happen. So when you get to the 100 megawatt type scale, those commercial demonstrations, that funding is not currently in place to get federal support at those types of levels. It's much smaller. And the pipelines we're talking about, just to answer an earlier question, for their couple million tons a year, that's a 10-inch diameter pipe because it's pressurized to the point where it acts more like a liquid, the CO2.
Follow-up, Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just then, thank you. It sounds like yes and no. So maybe we could have research or somebody, get that information. So it sounds like there are federal and state subsidies. It would be kind of nice to know as this conversation goes on, just how much those subsidies are. And it sounds like there's some kind of methodology behind getting those. So I would ask that, please, Mr. Chair, if you could.
Thank you, Senator Hoffman. Yes, we'll have staff probably, or have staff follow up.